Welcome to the Centre for Geopolitics from Cambridge University in the UK, and thank you for joining us today. Our subject today is historical, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941, the largest military operation in history, opening up the Eastern Front in the Second World War. It led, of course, to unprecedented violence and destruction and paved the way for a dramatic change in the political landscape of post-war Europe, split into Eastern and Western blocs for over 4 decades. But Operation Barbarossa is also an event which continues to divide opinion today. Its significance, the subject of debate, not just between historians, but also politicians, illustrating the gulf that has reopened in recent years between Western nations and Putin's Russia. So as we approach the 80th anniversary of the start of Operation Barbarossa in almost exactly a month's time, it's a good moment to look at it more closely, to understand the course of the first few months of the invasion, its significance for the outcome of the Second World War, and what it means for relations between Russia and the West today. I'm Bridget Kendall, Master of Peterhouse, Cambridge, and former BBC Diplomatic and Moscow Correspondent, and I'll be your chair for this event. And I'm delighted to be joined by the distinguished broadcaster and writer, Jonathan Dimbleby, who will be introducing us to his latest book, which is devoted to this question, Barbarossa, How Hitler Lost the War. He's also the author of The Battle of the Atlantic and Destiny in the Desert, The Road to El Alamein. And as the respondent, with us also is Professor Claudia Weber, who is Professor of Contemporary European History at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. And she's also the author of a book on the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Der Pakt, Stalin, Hitler und die Geschichte einer mörderischen Allianz. And she's also written extensively on the role of historical memory in Central and Eastern Europe. So I'm very pleased to have you with us. And before we get going, just a few practical details about how this event is going to work. We'll start with Jonathan introducing us to his book in conversation with me, and then we'll hear from Claudia. Then after some discussion between the two of them, we'll turn to the audience for questions. And we've had a lot of people sign up for this event, and we're very keen to hear from you. So if you do have a question you'd like to ask, your microphones and cameras are switched off, but you can send in your questions, write them in the Q&A option on the screen, and do give your name and affiliation and where you're from, and say if your question is for either Jonathan or Claudia. And just to add that as well as live streaming this, the Centre of Geopolitics is recording this and will post it on the Centre's website. So let's get started, Jonathan, with you. Can I ask you, first of all, why write this book? Why Barbarossa?
Good question. I did not know a great deal about Barbarossa before I started to do my research. I had written the 2 books before that you mentioned, and wherever I looked there, because I was interested in the geopolitics and the diplomacy, as well as the strategy of particular battlefronts. And wherever I looked, up came the name Stalin, from Roosevelt, from Churchill, and I thought, I really want to understand this. That coincided with, as you said, the approach of the 80th anniversary. And what I then began to discover, which is what drove me on, was just how critically important Operation Barbarossa was. And I was brought up in a background where it was generally assumed that it was D-Day and the Western Front which won the war. And it's not a unique conclusion by any means, but maybe not held by a majority of individuals in the West who aren't specialists, came to the conclusion that the war was won on the Eastern Front. Moreover, it was actually, Hitler was in fact defeated to the extent that he wasn't able to beat the Soviet Union in that 6 months between June and December 1941. And it seemed like worth saying.
Yeah. So you call the book Barbarossa, but actually the first 50,000 pages are about what happened before the invasion. You started at the end of the First World War. Why the big run-up?
You genially said the first 50,000 pages. It was the first 50,000 words.
First 50,000 words. I'm sorry. Yes, thanks for the correction.
It's not the Britannica on Barbarossa, but
it is quite a big book, but not quite that big.
Correct. No, with Claudia's speciality, you have to understand Barbarossa. You have to at least go back to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. And then you say, well, how did that come to be formed? So I just found myself, as history does, going back and back and back. And of course, you go back into medieval times. But what became fascinating to me was the relationship between the two behemoths at the end of the First World War. They'd been fighting each other in 1917. At the end of the war, both states became pariah states. They were the two most powerful nations on the European continent. One because of its industrial development, the other because its size, its enormous raw material resources, and its population. And so I wanted to take that through in the context of how the events developed that led to the pact, which itself, when it was broken, led to the war. And that involved trying to explore the relationships between Russia and Germany, between London and Berlin, and London and Moscow. And that triangular relationship is very complex, but very fascinating, and how it played out. And there are very different views about whether people made right or wrong decisions. In the crudest terms, as it were, the view between Chamberlain and Churchill in Britain. But that those events were seismic in their impact was something that intrigued me. And I think when people are writing about Barbarossa, there's some wonderful military histories which focus on the battle. There's not much that sort of tries ambitiously, if you like, to encompass the big global picture, as well as the horrors that were perpetrated in that struggle and the impact of that struggle on the outcome of the war.
So what was the trigger for the invasion?
Say again?
What was the trigger for the invasion?
The trigger for the invasion, interestingly, because you have the pact was deeply cynical on both sides.
This is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
And the trigger, for different reasons, but the same part of the world, was actually the Balkans. The Soviet Union, Stalin would do almost anything to avoid fighting against Germany. His armies weren't prepared. He didn't want to do it. He knew that a struggle was probably inevitable, but he didn't want it at that stage. Hitler wanted to secure. Remember, he conquered the whole of the West. He conquered southern Europe, except for the Balkans, and he needed, in his own mind, his own sort of megalomaniacal, demonic way, to secure unique access to the mouth of the Danube and the territory, which is Bulgaria, Romania, and he was prepared, therefore, to do almost anything. By the same token, Stalin was not prepared to yield on that issue. And so in November, December of 1940, the trigger was when Hitler, he decided to go into Russia much earlier, when Hitler said to his high command, right, we're going to do Barbarossa. It's actually in early December that he said it, after a fateful meeting with Molotov, which ended up with old Stone Ass, as Molotov was known, either because he was so obstinate or because Hitler kicked him a great deal. Stalin kicked him a great deal, or both. But anyway, there was a fateful meeting, and Molotov did not yield under Stalin's orders. Hitler said, right, now I'm going to, this triggers it. And that's how that's why the Balkans was the trigger.
And as far as the Operation Barbarossa went, what was it that Hitler wanted out of it? What was his aim?
He had three essential goals, which were actually outlined for anyone who had been a student carefully at the time in Mein Kampf. There was the urge for Lebensraum after the humiliation of Versailles, and the sense that Germany had been pinioned, imprisoned in a way that was impossible for that state to flourish. Not allowed to have an army and a police force, effectively, its limbs severed in its own, in the perspective of many Germans. Hitler seized on that and shared the view. Lebensraum, the need for space, for land, for the Aryan supreme race in which to exercise its rights, its freedoms, and its opportunities. That was the first. Second was the threat to his vision, to his National Socialist vision, resided in the Soviet Union, in communism. He wanted to decapitate, destroy communism, and he called it the Judaic communist conspiracy, because his third ambition, and I suppose the most notoriously grotesque of all, was his urge to eliminate the Jews from the soil of Europe. He didn't mind where they went initially. He just wanted to be rid of Jews, because Jews were a bacillus, a virus. I mean, the language is so disgusting, we're not unfamiliar with it. But those were the three triggers, if you like, for his urge to invade the Soviet Union.
So tell us a bit more about the scale of Operation Barbarossa, because as I said, it was the largest military operation in history. So
never, it was unprecedented, and it'll never, of course, for all sorts of obvious reasons, won't be repeated in that way. More than 3 million men, 3.3 million Axis forces, a huge panzer army, artillery, more than 600,000, 650,000 or so horses, which had been commandeered from Germany's farms, because they did a lot of the hauling of the artillery and also carried soldiers. We think of the highly flexible, mobile panzers, but one of the problems of the invasion was that the panzers, on the whole, advanced much more rapidly in the early part of the invasion than, of course, the horses and the people were. And they got left behind. And that led to a lot of tension within and between the high command and Hitler. On the other side, a larger army, over 4 million men, more tanks, more aeroplanes. However, an army which was totally unprepared to meet the onslaught. An army that was demoralized at the top, that was ill-trained, that was ill-equipped, and was under strict orders not to cause any kind of provocation that might be exploited by Hitler or Hitler's generals or frontline generals. And Stalin, it is almost beyond belief, his ability to deny the evidence in order to confirm his delusion that the peace could be retained in the sense of the pact not being broken.
It was widely presumed, wasn't it, by the Germans, that the Red Army would collapse within weeks, but it didn't.
It was not. In the Winter War in Finland, the army performed so badly. It prevailed in the end, sheer size, but performed so badly that many people, not only in Germany but in the West, thought that it couldn't possibly survive the Red Army against an onslaught by the all-conquering Nazi forces, which had swept through Europe. As I said, they were the lowlands had been conquered. France was in German hands. Italy was an ally, and he was an unstoppable force. So it was widely presumed that within 6 to 8 weeks that the Red Army would collapse. In London, it was very strong. In fact, a great proportion of thinking in London was, well, the important thing is to keep them going for as long as possible. They will collapse, but we must keep them going, because if they can knock each other out on the battlefield, the Germans will win, but they'll be much weaker as a result of that battle. And that will make our extraordinarily difficult position at that point in the war much easier.
So there's hubris on the part of Hitler because he'd done so well in Europe. There was disdain for the Soviets after the Finnish war. But there was, I mean, people talk a lot, don't they, about the national fervor that there was on the Soviet side, which came into play. The ferocious resistance.
There were before the war, astute Germans who had the right to be in the Soviet Union because of the agreements that had been made earlier as part of a trade deal, and also military understandings. Their intelligence in the Soviet Union was very good, and they warned. I mean, it was ignored, but they warned quite clearly that the Soviet forces would fight far more fiercely, and they would fight until the bitter end, and they should not be regarded as an easy punch bag. And that's how it turned out. They retreated. The success, the speed of the initial advance was quite astonishing, the numbers of miles, kilometers that were covered in the first 2, 3, 4 weeks. And 2 weeks in, Franz Holder, the army chief of staff, was saying quite in his diaries, diaries are very important incidentally in any coverage of this area, as it's so much, said that we have already won. This is a long journey all the way to Moscow. We're already won, and they were very nearly halfway there by the middle of by early August, and so the strength of the Soviet armies was twofold. One is the readiness of the Supreme Command, which was ruthless. Stalin's readiness to eliminate as many soldiers as were required at the front, his own men, in a way that no democratic government could have countenanced. The British, Americans could not have conceivably fought in that way. They would not have done it. They were not allowed that level of killing, dying. And there were two aspects to that. One is, therefore, a ferocious will to terrorize men into fighting, to the extent, and it was helped by the way in which the German armies treated their prisoners of war, incidentally. That helped, because the fate worse than death on the battlefield was to be captured by the Germans. But if you were found guilty of deserting, and anyone who put up their hands was a deserter, effectively, then you were not only shot, but your family was punished as well. So that was quite an incentive to go on fighting. But overarching that, which is what you sort of raised at the beginning, was a very strong sense. I mean, initially, the Soviet intelligence service was very worried about the degree to which they would have popular support for the war, because of their lack of real understanding about what people felt about the nature of the Soviet society. And they were very relieved to discover that people were quickly regarding as what Stalin later called it the Great Patriotic War. They were losing their lands. They were having villages overrun. They were women and men were being slaughtered completely without qualm by the invading armies, and they fought with a ferocious patriotism for Russia. And it was very interesting. Stalin, who endless, terribly dull, from our perspective today, leaden speeches in Communist Party terms, became he made a famous speech in August, at the beginning of August 1941, in which he said, this comrades, friends, is a war for the soul of Russia. And he cited all the great names of literature. And the Russians being highly literate and informed and loving music, were very responsive to that speech. He was speaking to their souls. And that was a very powerful element alongside coercion. So the combination was very powerful. So they died and they died and they died again. And more men were thrown into the struggle. And it became an attritional conflict, and in the end, the Russians were bound to prevail.
You've hinted at the barbarism which you describe in your book, but what is it that singles it out as different from other fronts?
Well, it was on a scale that was there was no comparison. I mean, even I'd say on the Japanese front, of which I'm absolutely no expert in scale, it was dwarfed. And the intensity of hatred that on both sides became really almost beyond the use of language to describe. And people were quite openly in their diaries talking about their hatred. But there was a difference. On the German side, the soldiers, some at the top, although they sedulously were to deny it, and a great many ordinary soldiers shared absolutely the vision of Nazism, which regarded Slavs as an inferior species. They were not proper, they didn't count as human beings, and therefore they didn't have to be treated as human beings. So they were under orders to capture anyone who could be regarded as a communist, and that quickly became elided with the word Jew. And that then swept out to anyone who was a Slav, anyone who could be regarded as possibly harboring partisans or being an informer. And that hatred and contempt, a deep, deep atavistic contempt for humanity on the side of the German advancing armies. Of course, there were exceptions, and I got this note out just in case you asked me about it. This is a guy called Rupp, who was and some of the officers hated what they were seeing. This is one of them. They were ordered to surround a village, and then he heard the sounds of gunshot and children screaming, and I realized we were about to commit a massacre, he wrote in his diary. And then goes on, and what happened was that, and this happened again and again and again, the soldiers went through the village torching the cottages, thatch-roofed cottages of the villagers living in great poverty, both in Ukraine and also in Russia itself. And he said, and he read away, he said, we heard these terrible roaring of cattle, the shrieks of women and children, and then the cries faded away as we drove out of the village, and then behind us the sky was glowing red. On the other side, the response to that, because atrocity it begat atrocity inevitably, and on the other side, the depravity shocked even those participants who were doing it. We regrouped, they said, I think, having taken a village that the Germans had taken, the Russians, his group retook the village, and we seized 5 of the soldiers, and we literally tore them apart with our hands, ripping them apart, our teeth. One man using a table leg to smash a skull in. Now this I had to say this was not exceptional. This happened again and again and again. And then he added, tellingly, we killed these men in a frenzy of hatred. And that was not just battlefield adrenaline. It was deep hatred and revulsion for those who had taken their lands, for the fascist beasts, as they were described in the propaganda.
You give a lot of attention to the Einsatzgruppen. Tell us about these, what they were.
The Einsatzgruppen there were 4 on this front. They were the SS groups established by the SS. They were called task forces. Their initial task was to sweep up all threats to the invading armies by taking, as I touched on before, by capturing all those. There was a commissar's order before the war, all who were could be identified as commissars, and to eliminate them. That very swiftly became going into towns from north to south across this long front, going into towns and rounding up suspects, young men and Jewish men and women and children, rounding them up. And there's, hideous examples, which it becomes almost pornographic to describe it. It is so terrible, but you have to say these things, and shooting them. The first year of they oversaw the first year of the Holocaust as it's extended, because they found that they needed to kill Jews. That was because the interpretation of Hitler's will by Himmler and Heydrich, and then by all those around and below him, was yes, we have to get rid of the Jews, but that means actually killing them. And they rounded them up, and they lined them up outside pits. They bayoneted babies. They shot them, put them into pits, left them in the pits. And the first 1 million of the 6 million Jews killed in the Second World War, the first 1 million were in the first 6 months, and they were by shootings. That was the start of the Holocaust. And the oddity is, and Claudia might later have something to say about this, I don't know, but the oddity of this is how clinically efficiently it is described. So it's all there, described by the perpetrators in a cool language. We achieved this. It was almost like a competition. See how many Jews we can kill today. And so the Einsatzgruppen were supported. I'd say 2 more things about them. One is they were supported at every stage and on every front, not by all the indigenous peoples of the land occupied, but by significant parts of them in Poland, in Ukraine, in Latvia, and so on. And they were supported militarily and organizationally to achieve their objective. Poles and Ukrainians and indeed in Yugoslavia supported actively and participated in this set of atrocities. And then the Wehrmacht commanders at best averted their gaze from what was happening. They did not really want to know the best of them, and they barely mentioned the Einsatzgruppen at the time. They knew what was happening, but the Einsatzgruppen weren't under their command. They weren't under the military command. They were under political command of Himmler. And some of them were willing, enthusiastic contributors, providing men and other support means to make the killings possible. At Nuremberg, the generals went out of their way and said, "Oh no, we didn't really know about that." Not true, as was clear.
So let's come on to Moscow and the story of the Great Panic in October.
It's extraordinary. This is October of 1941. The propaganda machine in Moscow had learnt nothing, and it cranked into action at the start of the war, and it was victory, victory, victory all the way. It became, challenging victory, but nonetheless it was victory. But people were beginning to realize more and more that actually this German army was getting closer. The city was being bombed, Moscow was being bombed, not on with the same devastating impact as in the Blitz, but significant, and people coming back from the front with wounds. The stories were coming back from the front, so there was a lot of doubt. And then when in October there was a sudden switch of propaganda, so crude that you could one day it was victory will soon be ours, the invaders will be done. The next day was you have to now fight to save your country because the invaders are effectively at the gates. What they said, they weren't, but they weren't that far away. They were 60 miles away from the capital in October, and the result was immediate anarchy, complete destruction of the order of the state. People went on the rampage. They looted. They fled the city, but stole cars if they could, got lifts on trucks. They took people out of cars and took their jewelry. And it was several days of a completely alarming chaos. And there were rumors that Stalin had surrendered. There were rumors that Stalin had fled. In fact, the Politburo was meeting in the Kremlin, and they did decide that they would move the whole of the government structure out to what is the city of what is now Samara, and they did move there, and the diplomats were all moved out from there, and the journalists were all moved away, and a lot of the bureaucracy went as well. But some of those around Stalin wanted him to go as well, and they prepared a train for him. They prepared aircraft to take him out. In fact, he stayed. He decided to stay, and then they all stayed with him. And then they on I think the 18th of October, they issued a decree. The city was under a state of siege. You'd be shot if you didn't obey the curfew, and that wasn't too exceptional in warfare, incidentally. It happened elsewhere a lot, but the impact was a very swift restoration of order. And very soon they were playing chess again, openly in competitions, and the cinemas reopened. And at the same time, they made a massive effort of building up the circle, the perimeter. There are 3 layers of perimeter defenses of Moscow, using labor of allegedly volunteers, 600,000 or more, who just turned up and dug tank traps, big ditches, and therefore at the point at which, if they ever got to that point, it would make it very difficult for the tanks at least to take Moscow itself, which didn't mean to say that the city couldn't theoretically be surrounded as Hitler had hoped. And it was I have some, courtesy of a wonderful Russian translator and researcher, found some of the documents of people. A nurse in particular comes to mind, called Irina, describing this. She wanted to go and fight at the front, but she hadn't got her papers sorted out, and she describes the day-by-day event, and those are the sort of human stories that bring, I hope, vividly to life the scale of the crisis that the Soviet Union faced, and indeed the Germans are about to face.
Well, as the panzers got closer to Moscow, the weather began to deteriorate rather rapidly and the advance faltered. And after the war, the German commanders blamed this for the failure to take Moscow, that well-known general winter that Napoleon ran into. But you reject that explanation, don't you?
Well, I don't think it stands up to close scrutiny. That's why. You know, the weather was the easiest thing to blame. It was, it was also the thing that they should have been most prepared for, because it was an annual event. You get very heavy rains, and then you get extraordinarily low temperatures. And they knew about that, but such was the hubris, to use your earlier word, that they thought, well, we're going to do it, and we'll do it in any case. And so as the weather got worse and worse, and the vehicles got bogged down, the horses had to be released from the carts they were pulling because they were floundering in mud, you know, 2 meters deep, because the infrastructure just wasn't there, the kind that there was in Germany. The advance slowed hugely. Now, the Russians faced exactly the same weather, but they were rather better equipped to deal with it. They had particularly when the cold came, they had warm clothes, whereas the Germans were still in their summer clothing. Their tanks were tougher in those conditions because they were used to them, whereas the German tank, they couldn't get them going. They tried to light fires under them. Their rifles froze in the. You're talking about -20, -30 degrees. It's weather that you know very well from your time in Moscow. It is perishingly cold, and it's damp cold very often as well. In Siberia, there's a dry cold, but it wasn't. It was terrible, draining weather, and the Germans suffered from frostbite. There were amputations. Thousands of men couldn't fight and had to be withdrawn from the front because of injury, that injury, not self-inflicted injury, although there were those as well, but simply because they weren't in the fit state to fight. The reason why I think it doesn't stand up is that what does stand up was it definitely slowed the advance, and it allowed the Russians to reinforce their own defenses. The Germans were now a very long way from their bases. They were hundreds. They were what, 600 miles from their bases. You know, this is a very big, and they didn't have the logistics to sustain the army. So the frontline commanders were tearing their hair out. We are depleted. Our units are down, sometimes by 50%. Our tank units are down. Our guns are freezing up. The men are very cold. We need clothes, and they were both on the one hand repudiated, told just get on with it, but from the high command it appeared to be absolutely unaware of how bad it was. And then when they were aware of it, they're saying it's coming, and it never came in the quantities required. So the weather had an impact, but the idea that it was a decisive impact is, for me, very, very unpersuasive. They were doomed in any case for other factors than the weather.
Interesting, you're saying
exacerbated that problem.
But you are actually saying you think it's the same thing as Napoleon, aren't you? Who was also a very long way and had supply chain problems.
Yeah, well, you know, it is not without significance that one of the fiercest battles was fought on Napoleon's famous battleground of Borodino. At Borodino, in fact, Napoleon won, but the non-victory of the Russian armies was also regarded as a triumph against them, because they resisted very well against Napoleon and weakened Napoleon. In the case of the Borodino battle in 1941, again the Germans prevailed, but unaware that they might kind of read the runes or the writing on the wall or whatever you want to say, they continued to advance against, and by that time, this was now in late November, by that time the commanders at the front are saying, we've got an impossible task, we can't do it. we actually can't do it. Our men are exhausted, we're drained. Now that, I think, would have happened regardless of the weather, but the weather certainly helped that beginnings of the collapse of the attempt to take Moscow.
So what happened to turn the advance of the foremost panzers, just I think 20 miles from Moscow by early December,
about 20 miles,
into within days full retreat?
Because finally Hitler permitted a tactical withdrawal, and actually it had already started. The Second Panzer Army under Guderian had already decided to retreat. He'd done everything he could to take to capture the south. Guderian was the sort of audacious, bold, buccaneering, difficult hero tank panzer commander, and he actually was, his forces were based in Tolstoy's home at Yasnaya Polyana, and that's where they were, and Moscow was, you know, within reach. But he realized it would be quite impossible because the Soviets kept reinforcing their defenses, and the closer the defenses got to Moscow, the more easy it was to reinforce them. And by that time, they were bringing troops in from Siberia, because Stalin knew that the Japanese were not going to invade. He'd got intelligence warning they were not going to invade Siberia, which is why he'd had a huge number of troops held in Siberia. These were hardened, trained men, and the Germans feared them. Their tanks were also the T-34, which was the best tank, was a smarter tank. It was stronger than the panzers. And Guderian was saying with real alarm, our panzers, it's like firing a pop gun at the T-34. And the only way they could get the T-34 was to go around the back of the tank and lob into through the not what do you call it, you know, the tower of the tank down into the conning tower, and that was exceptionally difficult. So they had more men. They were building up their weaponry faster, and a lot of that weaponry was better than the German weaponry. The Germans were economically very severely stressed. They didn't have enough men to replace at that point those that they were losing, and they couldn't make good the deficit of armor as well.
So the war was to go on for 3.5 more years, actually.
Yeah.
And many people talk about Stalingrad in 1943 as this turning point.
Yeah.
Of course, it was astonishing and dramatic. But you say actually it was Moscow 1941.
Yes, I do. Anthony Beevor, who's the great historian of Stalingrad, says it in that book, in his preface, words to the effect that, which I didn't know until very late in the day, because he doesn't look at it in any detail. He said Moscow was the military turning point. Stalingrad was the psychological turning point for the Germans. And of course, it was a very important turning point. But if my interpretation of the events is correct, although the German armies were restored, and when Speer became armaments minister, there was a surge in production, an astonishing achievement of organization. Nonetheless, the Soviet armies were always growing that much faster, and Hitler was getting further and further away. You know, it was folie de grandeur, if you will, in the most generous terms. It was a sort of manic operation, and of course it cost enormously. And then there were battles after that. There was the biggest tank battle war in Kursk, but these were all victories. Well, I say victories. Kursk was not a victory; it was a defeat. In 42, before Stalingrad, there were small victories, but there were strategic setbacks that were far more important. And that's why I say, that it was in 1941 that, when you look at it from today, you can see that Hitler could not win. Indeed, there were those at the time who were very dubious in the German high command that they could go on, but no one dared, You know, the supine high command around Hitler. No one dared confront him or challenge him. They either shared the vision, or they certainly never dared. And what's interesting about this, the illusion that the German armies were this fantastically efficient machine as they'd seemed to be in the West. You know, there were huge falling outs and rows and arguments and people wanting to resign and asking if someone else, you know, Bock, who was the commander of the Central Front when Hitler kept suggesting, this is in August, that they should go south, and actually they had to because Hitler ordered it, and then up to the north as well, and then changing his mind again. Bock wanted to resign and hoped that he could persuade others to resign with him. You know, he was the commander of the main front, and people didn't go that far, and so he couldn't resign. So the scale of the lack of unity in the command structure from the top to the bottom is far more, I think, significant than generally people have liked to believe about the war machine of Nazi Germany.
Well, Jonathan, you've given us a wonderful tour d'horizon of what there is to plumb in your book, and what a fascinating time this is. There are other questions I could ask, and we've got over 100 people who've joined us at this event, and we're looking forward to your questions, everybody. But before we do that, I'd like to turn to Claudia and bring you in for your response, picking up on some of the things that have been said so far and introducing some new thoughts.
Okay, everything's fine. Yeah, first of all, it's great to be here, and thanks again to Cambridge University and to Brandon Sims for this invitation. And before I start my response, just let me quickly respond to what Jonathan just said, a couple of ideas. I mostly totally agree that to look at Barbarossa, you also have to look at the Hitler-Stalin Pact and the time before. So, I mean, and for the Pact, Barbarossa is a decisive moment. And it's not only that with Barbarossa, the Hitler-Stalin Pact ends, but as I guess I will describe this further a little bit more in detail. There are similarities between Stalin's behavior in 39 and 41. So it's quite interesting to look at both men and their behavior when the Second World War started, and then when the Germans invaded into the Soviet Union. So, and of course, the time before. I mean, just keep us in mind that, in fact, the Germans paid the Bolshevist Revolution, so the Kaiserreich, and so in fact, I guess all the events you mentioned from the beginning, from the early 20th century. It's all a story, a wonderful, intriguing story about this troubled German-Soviet relationship, Russian relationship. And then, of course, and I totally agree with Jonathan, I would add with the Russian, German, and British relationship. This indeed is such a fascinating triangle. Most historians, I guess, really underestimate. So we have either books on the German-Russian relationship or the German-British, but not so much books or studies, analyses that really look at this triangle. And yeah, actually, when I have time, I would love to write a book exactly about these Churchill, Hitler, and Stalin. So. Yeah, then I agree with you, Jonathan, that the Balkans were really the trigger. So when Molotov went to Berlin, it became clear very fast. But I would add that Finland too. There's this protocol about about the talk between Hitler and Molotov, and Ribbentrop and Molotov. And I mean, Molotov, he was upset because in the secret protocol of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Finland, since the secret protocol, Finland belonged to the Soviet sphere of interest. And then all of a sudden, there were German troops in Finland. So, and of course, Molotov was asking, what's about this? Why are German troops in Finland? And the Soviet Union and Stalin and Molotov, they regarded this really as a betrayal of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the German troops in Finland. So, and this too, I guess, it kind of deepened the problems both already had. And I would argue that after Molotov's visit to Berlin, the pact indeed was over. So both sides knew that the conflicts will just overrun the agreements or the pact. So, yeah, and okay, I guess that's mainly what I wanted directly to ask to your introduction or your lecture. So, and I would actually, what I would like to do in my response is a little bit to concentrate on the problem of historical memory and today's Putin's politics in regard to the Second World War and Barbarossa, and then to link this current debate on historical memory again to Barbarossa and to the historical event, and especially to our notion of, and you wrote about this too in your book, on our notion that Stalin has been surprised, that he was surprised by Hitler's attack, and about his paranoia. So just let me start maybe with Putin's current politics. And I guess, of course, you know that since at the latest, since the end of Putin's second term as president in 2008, we see it's not so much a comeback of Stalin, but what we see is a kind of reinterpretation of the historical figure of Stalin. Because Putin, he does not deny the violent history of Stalinism. So it would be politically very unwise to do so. So he never denies the violent history of Stalinism. And he even unveiled in Moscow the so-called Wall of Grief in 2017, a monument to the victims of the political persecution by the Stalinist system. And he never broke this tradition of the annual Day of Remembrance, which is the last day of October. And this is since 1991, the annual Day of Remembrance of the victims of political repression. So he did not broke with this tradition which exists since the Gorbachev years, since the Perestroika. So, but what he does, though, is to draw the attention away from the terrible side of Stalin to his accomplishment as a political and military leader, and here comes to Barbarossa, to the Soviet victory of World War II, and as I said, to the Great Patriotic War that for the Russians started with Barbarossa in June 1941. And usually in my lecture on the Second World War, I ask my students when they think World War II started. And very often my students who come from Ukraine or from Russia, and they say in 41. So 39 is not, for them, it's not the beginning of World War II, but it's the Great Patriotic War, it's 41. And so in this narrative, the brutality of Stalinism somehow appears like it's dreadful, but it's a secondary story compared to the glorious victory. And so while promoting, and this is really what Putin wants, promoting Stalin's image as violent but triumphant savior of the Soviet Union, Putin at the same time fights any attempt to relativize or even undermine his narrative by pointing to 1939, to the beginning of World War II and Stalin's alliance with Hitler's Germany. So here, again, both events, 41 and 39, are linked also in regard to historical memory. And really one of the most astonishing examples for such an attempt is an official statement of the European Parliament from September 2019. And I don't know to much extent this statement is known in Great Britain. The Parliament's public quotation of National Socialism and Stalinism, as well as the demand to hold both sides responsible for the war, and the declaration was adopted without a dissenting vote, really provoked Moscow's sharp and manifold protests. Significantly, that's really interesting. I mean, it's such a, I mean, you have to read this declaration. It's so frank. It's so, it's not what German historiography discusses. So I was really surprised by this declaration, and it has not been discussed publicly in Germany. So I'm always wondering about this, since I mean it's an official statement by the European Parliament about the start of the beginning of World War II. So in reaction to this, for instance, all we Eastern European historians in Germany received letters by the Russian embassy in June 2020. And of course, Putin's letter, as we call this, told the story of Barbarossa along the lines of the mainstream narrative of the Great Patriotic War. And it all started with an episode from Putin's family history. So, and again, Putin here does not deny the Hitler-Stalin Pact or the infamous secret protocol. However, the trick now is in current Russian politics and in Putin's narrative to put the pact in line with other treaties nations like Great Britain, France, or Poland signed with Nazi Germany. And so the Russian motto, Putin's motto at the moment is, if we are to blame because of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, then so is entire Europe. And moreover, against the background of the Franco-German Declaration of 1938, the Polish rapprochement in the mid-30s, and the British appeasement, Putin argues that we are only the last in a row with our pact in August. So Putin's, as I would call it, and then I go back to Barbarossa, Putin's Europeanization, it's really a kind of Europeanization of the responsibility for World War II, really sets a new tone in a memory war that began with the political changes in Eastern Europe since the 90s. And this memory war has since been really upsetting the established war memory, not only in Russia, but in Western Europe as well. And I don't know how far you are familiar with the debates, especially in German historiography, about the comparability of the Holocaust and the Stalinist crimes in Eastern Europe. So it's really an interesting debate. However, the trouble somewhat eases when it comes to Barbarossa. And here we continue to see a very striking and long-lasting correspondence that reads as follows. And I mean, as well in the West as in the East. The story goes that Hitler's dreadful attack took a paranoid Stalin by surprise. A Stalin who furthermore ignored our warnings, no matter how concrete and solid they were. And to be honest, I really have a hard time buying this, and I really doubt both images. I don't believe that Stalin was surprised, and I don't believe that we here deal with a paranoid and therefore ignorant dictator. Given Hitler's aggressive anti-Bolshevism, the idea of a surprise for me seems kind of awkward. So Hitler and Stalin, as you said, Jonathan, Hitler and Stalin knew that the pact was only temporary, and they did not even expect it otherwise. So, and then if Stalin was really paranoid, then why should he be surprised at all? So he wouldn't be surprised if he was paranoid. So I don't think really, and you show this wonderfully in your book, I don't think that Barbarossa is a story about surprise, paranoia, or ignorance, at least not on the Stalin side. I would argue that it's even more on Hitler's side. That Hitler was more, when somebody was paranoid, then Hitler was paranoid in the situation. But it's always, it's hard, I mean, to psychologize in history. So, but I will make two arguments for my thesis. And I would argue, first of all, that it's not a story about paranoia. It's a story about soberly calculated alternatives. And I will just very briefly discuss two. The first alternative is aggression or defense. And Stalin hated the image of an aggressor. Already, and here again, 39 and 41 are really close, linked. Already back in September 39, Stalin prevented to be blamed as one, and he willingly let Hitler go first and even annoyed the German ally by waiting 2 weeks before the Red Army marched into Poland. In June 41, Stalin acted quite in a similar way. He waited, he forbade provocations, and he would never have taken the first step, because that would have meant invading German-occupied territory, the Generalgouvernement. And as a keen student of Clausewitz, and Stalin was a keen student of Clausewitz, Stalin knew the advantages of being in the defender's position, that it's much better to be the defender instead of being the aggressor. And in military strategical terms, as well as I would argue in regard to historical memory, it's always better to be remembered as the glorious defender and then being on the victorious side than the losing aggressor. So what I would argue here is that to throw the warnings to the wind, all the warnings he got, was a rather smart move. And it was not a mistake. So I guess there was no alternative to it. The second alternative is the concentration of troops at the border or in the hinterland. And Stalin has often been accused of choosing the latter option, not to throw all the troops immediately on the border. And that he did so even against the advice of his generals. So his decision has often been regarded as a sign for a fatal misperception of the entire situation, as well as for the unpreparedness and weakness of the Red Army after the Great Purges. And it's true as the deplorable condition of the Red Army was. And Stalin complained openly in a speech in early May about this deplorable condition of the Red Army. I believe that he used this disadvantage as good as he could. Again, turning out as keen student of Clausewitz, Stalin allowed Hitler to advance into the Soviet Empire, and he allowed Hitler to advance in order to, first of all, weaken the military strength of the Wehrmacht. And you talked about this today in detail. The weather condition, and it's true that it's not General Winter played a role, but not the decisive role. But there's the weather condition, the vastness of the land, the frictions within the German military elite, the weariness, the disappointment of the soldiers, the exhaustion of the soldiers. So that's all very much, you describe it in your book, very wonderful. And I would call this, and we talked about this today too, the Napoleon 1912 archetype. So there are some parallels and similarities. And he also, of course, Stalin took advantage of Hitler's hybris after the Blitzkrieg in spring-summer 1940. And he even talked about this in his speech in May, about the German hybris. And he won time to spare the rare military forces he had, whereas the Germans exhausted their resources very quick. To be sure, I think Stalin's game was risky, but as Jonathan's brilliant book vividly shows us, already in August 41, 8 weeks after the invasion, the tide turned in favor of the Soviet dictator. So the second argument for this alternative, Stalin allowed Hitler to advance. Secondly, to let him do the dirty work of dealing with the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Baltic nationalists, troublemakers, and so-called enemies of the people. So again, let us keep in mind that Stalin had only gained this population in 39 and in 40 due to the pact with Hitler. Again, here we have the Hitler-Stalin pact. Since then, the newly acquired borderlands had caused him and Beria's NKVD great hassle. In a striking similarity to the decision in 39, namely to leave central Poland and henceforth the main Polish resistance to Hitler, Stalin in 41 left the Ukrainian resistance to the Germans, who proved incapable of using Ukrainian anti-Bolshevism for their own ends. So therefore, I would argue that it was a decision. It was Stalin's decision to let the troops, to concentrate the troops more in the hinterland, and really to weaken the Wehrmacht and to let Hitler the dirty work in the Ukraine and in Belarus and then in the Baltic states as well. So I come to my conclusion. Stalin won World War II, but I would always argue that he did not want this war at all. And it's true, he tried to postpone Hitler's attack by increasing the raw material supplies, among others. He even offered Hitler to sacrifice the Comintern, as he then finally did in 43, in order to please the Western Allies. But when Barbarossa became inevitable, Stalin dealt with Barbarossa sober, as a brutally calculating dictator, as a keen student of military history, and following the bitter logic of Stalinism, that human life does not count at all. And I think this is an inner logic of, even I would say, rational behavior of societies of violence. We all too often tend to hide behind our dear, but I would say misleading image of the paranoid, hence irrational and or uncivilized man far away in the Moscow Kremlin. And sometimes it seems for me that this is also part of our own irrationality, to look at Moscow as an irrational place or uncivilized place. So that's it, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Lots of food for thought there. Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to come back on immediately? You need to unmute.
I was listening, fascinated, and and touched by your generosity about the book, of course. It is such an extraordinarily interesting analysis that you have. I'm not going to use all my space to sort of contest it, although I have some questions about it. So what I'd say in the word in comment is that that he was paranoid in the view of most historians, and a view that I don't dissent from, given his readiness to see enemies even in his friends in the 1930s and to kill huge numbers of people, which I deal with in the book. That paranoia did not make him irrational, although he had irrational aspects. He was extraordinarily, rather like Hitler, behaved in very rational ways, given his totally irrational objective. Conversely, the paranoia of Stalin led to him not wanting to hear anything that didn't fill him with the validity of his paranoia. That didn't make him irrational. I think that the compelling evidence that an invasion was imminent, overwhelming evidence. You might have thought, you said it was a gamble, that had he been as far-sighted, as it were, in allowing the Wehrmacht to advance in the way you so eloquently describe, it would have to have been carefully planned, and there's no evidence that I've come across that that was well prepared. Far more persuasive to me is that he could have had the defense. I agree with you about that he should appear to be defensive, that the military advantage to it is normally with the defenders too. The old military dictum of you have to have 3-to-1 advantage if you want to engage. Hitler never had the 3-to-1 advantage. But you would have thought that his defenses would have been rather better prepared, so that the fallback could have, the retreat could have been weakened the German armies much more effectively, as opposed to having huge numbers of prisoners taken. And so that's just the only caveat I'd have about that. I think it's really interesting what you say. On the other side, the role of the Patriotic War. I completely agree with what you say about the way in which it plays into the historic memory and narrative of Putin's Soviet, there's a Freudian slip, so Putin's Russia. I remember when I was there in 2008 in Russia, traveling all the way through, this was the point at which, 2007, 2008, the point at which all the young pioneers were being taught about the enemies, the surrounding enemies. There are endlessly crude videos which showed north, south, and west attacks on Mother Russia. And so he plays up the Patriotic War as a means of securing his authority over a state that is otherwise, financially in a terrible state, economically in a weak state, where people are suffering, so that the comparison between his Russia in terms of its potential and the reality of the West's potential under a totally different system is startling. So what do you play on? You play on the fears of people. It's historically very effective. That's the only second thing. The third last thing before that I'd add is I'm afraid, and I was fascinated by the European Parliament's declaration, which you identify. I did not know of it, and maybe others probably will, and no doubt Bridget is, that the Soviet Union was to blame for the pact. Had I been a Russian citizen, I think I would have been appalled by the thought I was responsible for the Second World War. It seems to be bizarre beyond belief. At the very least, as it were, okay, so the pact was cynical, it postponed war. What was he supposed to do? Declare war? To allow war to develop? There was no possibility that the Western allies were going to go east of Western Europe. They were not going to go into, as it was made very clear by Chamberlain, they weren't going to go into Poland to liberate the Poles. Stalin wanted to know in the negotiations, which I also think are very important, the Anglo-Soviet negotiations, wanted to know and the French actually were prepared to accept this. If there was an invasion by the Germans of Poland, would the Western allies support the Soviet Union going into Poland to counter that. Is that what was wanted? Is that, you know, and the fact that they didn't give that consent, did that mean that he was responsible for the Second World War? I just thought it's completely bizarre. I mean, I happen to be a very strong pro-European and deplore what has happened in the context of the Brexit vote. Abhor it beyond words, but that's seems to me as the European Parliament at its most ignorant and at its most humdrum.
Let's bring in a couple of our audience who are listening. So, our first question comes from Emilia Rushkite. I hope, Emilia, that's how you pronounce it. And it's for you, Jonathan, although maybe, Claudia, you want to pitch in too, because it goes back to Finland's position. So you've both talked about the importance of Finland in the trigger and the Finnish War and how that emboldened Hitler to think that the Soviet Union was weak, so it would be a pushover. But the question that Emilia wants is to explain Finland's position in the Barbarossa operation. So, Jonathan, to you.
Yeah, Claudia rightly points to the importance of the fact that it was in my view a secondary trigger, but it was an important factor. And Finland had tried and had hoped that the British would come to the aid of Finland to give support to the Finns, and Churchill had a very good relationship with the Finnish Prime Minister, Commander-in-Chief of the army. They'd fought together during the White War, the Civil War, and in fact the Foreign Office took the view that we should support. The British High Command said there was no way we could support the Finns. So the background was that the Finns wanted to protect their territory. They had lost territory under the agreement with Moscow at the end of the Winter War, which left Moscow in control of parts of Finlandia, but to the isthmus beyond, to the west of St. Petersburg as now is, and Leningrad was. There were good reasons militarily for the Soviets to want to control that, because the German threat was, if they occupied Finland, as it transpired, was going to be very potent, which was that's why they wanted that territory. But when the Finns sided with decided to throw in their lot against the enemy that had invaded them in the Winter War with the Germans, in the absence of any support from the West, the Finns played a minor part. They played an important but minor part because what they did was to secure those approaches to Leningrad, which protected their own territory. They didn't go beyond their own territory, so they were like sort of blocking group, if you like, that made it more difficult for the Red Army to protect. They couldn't advance to drive the Germans out of Finnish territory, and as it happens, they couldn't stop the encirclement of Leningrad. So they were in a supportive role. And then later in 1943, I'll be corrected. They then 44. They sued for peace once, along with a lot of other Eastern European states, once it was clear that the Germans were on the retreat, and the Russians, when the Red Army in 1944 was attacking northwards into the Baltic, there was essentially no opposition from the Finns, because the Finns recovered their territory. They did a deal with the Russians, and that led to the kind of post-war settlement, which was also, in my view, created in 1941, which we haven't talked about. But that's not a very, sorry, it's a long-winded answer for you. I hope it helps a bit. It's very complicated territory.
Anything you want to add, Claudia?
Yeah, actually, I only want to add that, I mean, Finland was important for Stalin and the Soviet Union. First of all, I guess following an imperial logic. So it was part of an old Russian imperial thinking that Finland, of course, belongs to the Soviet sphere of interest. And it really became this point of contention. And of course, after the Winter War, so the Finnish Soviet War, then of course Hitler thought that he might negotiate about Finland again. And so for Stalin, for the Soviet Union, it was natural to get Finland. And then and they did not achieve this with this war, and then they had to try later. But later on, Hitler was even more interested in Finland, and it was part of his plan in Scandinavia. So, and therefore, as Jonathan said, and I just want to add this, that this is really a complex story, and also the domestic politics of the Finnish government. So it's also an interesting point. And I would really, again, link the Soviet-Finnish war and then to the end of the Hitler-Stalin Pact and to Barbarossa. Both events are also linked, and we oversee this very much, very often, because we tend to separate the first 22 months of the Second World War from then what happened after 41.
Can I just add one thing to that, Bridget?
Go ahead.
Only that I agree with you about the assumption that by right, the Soviet Union had that territory, as the same assumption applied to the Baltic states, it applied to Ukraine, it applied to Crimea. This was traditional Tsarist territory. That was a protective wall against enemies on the one hand. On the other hand, if there was to be a conflict, it was a very good front line from which to approach.
So maybe that partly answers the question that I was about to ask you, which is from Torsti Putanen. And this relates to, it's related more to the Baltics, but also Finland. Soon after the German attack, Churchill offered to help the Soviet Union without conditions. So the question is, did Churchill's cabinet ever consider putting conditions on its help instead of making it unconditional? So could the UK, for instance, have required the Soviet Union to restore the status of the Baltic countries and return the parts of Finland and Poland and Romania that had been annexed in 39-40?
The short answer is no, but it's a qualified no, because Churchill's view was that the future borders of the Soviet Union and the spheres of influence would be settled at the end of the war. He was totally wrong about that. It actually was finally settled effectively in 1943, but it was mooted way back in 1941. The implication, not the implication, one way of interpreting the question was that the sort of pressure that Churchill could put on Stalin would require Stalin to say, yes, I will hand back, because there was the commitment by the British to Lend-Lease, which is what we're talking about, the aid to the Soviet Union, was large on rhetoric and small on content. For instance, there was virtually nothing reached of Lend-Lease, for other good reasons, that reached the Soviet Union in 1941. It was later, in 1943-44, that Western aid became quite significant once the Soviets were on the offensive against the Germans. So he didn't, they always say, speak softly and wave a big stick. That's where real power lies. And but he didn't. He had a very loud voice and a very small stick in this context.
Claudia, anything you want to say on that? No. Okay. I mean, there's a broader question here. Actually, this is to you, Claudia. It's about the memory of war and the way the memory of war has been used since 1945, because it's changed in different places, hasn't it? I mean, I tracked it through the Soviet Union. For years, it was used to justify a deficit goods economy. Oh, we were battered in the war. Who's to, it's not surprising we have a difficult time of it now. And to create a sense of unity as the original Bolshevik ideology faded away, which is to Jonathan's point about the power of fear of outside enemies. But there are all sorts of other things, aren't there? And I mean, if you look at the way the narrative in, say, the Soviet Union has changed, Brendan reminded me, Brendan Sims, of the way they use it to appeal to they've always played up the Arctic convoys. And so, you know, is that partly to, in the past perhaps, to appeal to the British, though you think now perhaps they don't want to bother? And what is playing up the memory of the war on the Russian side? What is the aim there vis-a-vis Germany? Is it a kind of psychological pressure of some sort, or have we gone beyond that now? So do unmute.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it's, you know, I cannot just now explain or describe this history of historical memory toward the World War II during the Soviet Union and today. It's just, I mean, of course, there are changes, and we have those changes with the Khrushchev, and the Stalinization, and yeah, it's too complex, I guess. But the similarity between this time of the Soviet Union and today is that the Great Patriotic War really is the one working, functioning integration myth of the, not only of the Russian people, but if you have read or known Putin's speech, which he gave, I guess it was in the end of, in December 2019, he gave a very remarkable speech in Petersburg. It was on a GUS meeting. And when all the members of the GUS states, they still exist, summoned and summoned in St. Petersburg, and then he talked about the use of the memories of the Great Patriotic War as it's our war. It's not only a Russian war, but it's also a war of the former states of the Soviet Union. So it's even more than Russia, but it works, and it works until today. So whenever one talks about the Stalinist crimes, Katyn, for instance, then there still is this memory, this narrative of the victory over Hitler. So, and I don't know, this aim towards Germany, I think there aren't at the moment. I can't see at the moment many problems between the German historical memory and the Russian historical memory in regard to Barbarossa or in regard to the Second World War. I see there are more conflicts, or this relationship is really conflict-ridden between Poland and the Baltic states and Russia, and then the memory of the Second World War and Barbarossa. And again, to the point of, to the declaration of the European Parliament, I mean, really this declaration shows this conflict. This is not a conflict between Western Europe and Putin, but it is a conflict between the members of the European Union from Eastern Europe. So this declaration was an initiative from the Baltic states and from Poland, of course. And I was in Brussels at the time to introduce the Hitler-Stalin Pact book. And there were a couple of people from the Russian embassy there at the presentation, and it was a huge discussion and a debate and a beef there. So it's more really the memory war. The memory war now is between Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Russia.
Yeah, I was going to say, from what you were saying, it's interesting when you come to Ukraine now, isn't it? Whether this narrative really works to make Ukrainians feel that they were part of the Great Patriotic War, which liberated them from Nazism or not. You know, that doesn't quite work so well anymore in what was the Soviet hinterland. But I'm not going to go there any further because we can come back to that, but we're running a little bit out of time. And there are a few questions I just wanted to, Jonathan, you wanted to come in? You need to unmute. Maybe you should stay unmuted, both of you, because otherwise.
I'll stay unmuted. I just say two things. I think the overwhelming role is of the Great Patriotic War currently for Putin is internal and to consolidate the support of those outside who are instinctively tend towards Russia than towards the West. And Ukraine's a very good example of that. Remember, in Ukraine, there was a vicious civil conflict was going on in the Second World War. Ukrainians were fighting Ukrainians. The Poles were fighting against Ukrainians. There was the most vicious war going on in 1943, 1944, in which it was in every way, and in some ways more barbaric than the worst that was perpetrated within Russia itself. So those divided memories are divided memories in Ukraine. I mean, I'm sure Claudia, who knows more about this than me, would confirm this. Those divided memories in Ukraine are what Putin is able to play on in his attitude towards that country. The ability of him to walk without much protest into Crimea was for similar reasons. You know, there was a greater sympathy, not only in language, but in culture and history between the Crimeans.
Oh, hang on, the Russians in Crimea.
Sorry, the Russians in Crimea, exactly, sorry. And Crimea, and then what did he do? He gets rid of the Tatars, he kicks out the Tatars, he ruthlessly treats the Tatars like he treated the Chechens. So you have an environment in which he can speak to those who say, yes, I need reminding of that, as well as talking to his own people. And I don't think Germany has any impact on German, well, Claudia knows much more than I do about that. I'd be very surprised.
A question from John Scarlett, who wants to pick up on the discussion we had earlier about whether Stalin was a rational player or not. If Stalin had a controlled, rational approach to the build-up of the invasion, how do you explain the detailed evidence of him rejecting the continuous intelligence reports up to the 22nd of June itself? And what about his depression and defensive behavior in the last days of June? Maybe that's one for you, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, I think I don't actually think it's to do with. I think it was from his perspective, in my view, rational. He wasn't prepared. Because I say differ from Claudia on this. You see, I think that there was he didn't want to believe what he was being told by the intelligence service. So his paranoia told him that they were dupes of the Germans, or they were secret German agents seeking to mislead him. I think he wanted to deter war at all costs, and that was quite a rational thing to do because the evidence was overwhelming. I think that and he also believed that if he were to build up the forces and make what he called a provocation, i.e. have some kind of defensive line, instead of having everyone over the midsummer on holidays and on training and frontline troops without even weapons, adequate resources. I don't think that he would have done that if he had been of the view that it was a rational way of defending himself. I thought his rational approach was stop Hitler doing it now. And that was quite reasonable. John, I don't know whether I answered that question adequately. I'd be happy to have another go at it, but you won't want me to.
Okay, and another question. This is from Roger Bass. Considered in a more Eurasian context, places like the South Caucasus may take on a new significance. So are any historical events in that region significant in the World War II context?
Well, the Caucasus was, of course, because in the Caucasus you had some support for the Nazi invaders. The Caucasus was punished horrifically by Stalin to suppress any semblance of independence, except nominal, and all the ethnic groups from the Caucasus were removed from the Tatars finally. I mean, Tatars finally got their thing back. They got their territory and rights restored to them, but not 40 years after, 50 years after the war. the Caucasus, you have the oil in the Caucasus, which was important because Hitler wanted the oil. The Baku oil wells were critically important. Britain veered between bombing the Baku oil wells to prevent Hitler getting at them, and the Soviet. And this goes incidentally. This is part of what we talked about earlier in the Balkans. If Hitler could control the Balkans, he had much easier access to the Baku oil wells. The Soviets did not want the Baku oil wells, for obvious reasons, to go to Hitler. So it was there. It wasn't. There was a more complex big picture in the Balkans than in the South Caucasus directly. But of course, South Caucasus is so closely linked to the Balkans that it is relevant. But
let me just put one.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. Claudia, is there something you would like to add there?
Unmute.
No, very brief. Not to the Caucasus. No, I just to the intelligence reports. I mean, my point is that I don't know if Stalin believed the reports or if he did not believe it. My question is, so what should he have done? I mean, if he had believed, so should he do the first step and invade the Generalgouvernement and attack Hitler? I mean, what is the option? What is the alternative here? I mean, if he believed, what follows? So I don't know, and I think, as Molotov once said in his talk with Felix Chuev in this Molotov, I guess it's published in English. The 100. It's Felix Chuev. Was a Russian journalist. And Molotov then said that, of course, Stalin did not believe the intelligence reports, but because you should never believe intelligence reports. So, and I guess, Jonathan, you quoted this in your book, the Molotov phrase. So, but it's a question about options. And I argue that he had no other option than just to wait till it happens. So.
Okay, one final question. This is from one of our PhD students here at Peterhouse, Alex Sompanidis, who's Greek, and says a lot has been said about the importance of the Greek resistance and that the invasion was delayed and forced to deal with the Russian winter because of it. Is that plausible or a politician's story? It's
very important territory. I write about it quite extensively because it's very, very interesting. In brief, one of the fears that Hitler had was that the British would invade from the south through Greece up into what unhappily Churchill later was to call the soft underbelly of Germany. Conversely, the British feared, and there were plans for this, and they were taken very seriously. It was going to be the next stage of the war. Took very seriously the threat to Britain's imperial Middle Eastern and Indian empire by a German move south. So there was constant negotiation. Can we get the Turks on our side? Can we ensure that the Turks remain neutral? In the end, Hitler was driven to go south. He, destroyed Belgrade in a most ghastly mass bombing of that city, and then ran through Greece because the Italians had failed lamentably to achieve their objective of taking Greece themselves. So he decided he had to go south. Both of the powers were wrong about the intentions of the other, incidentally. That was one of the intriguing. The Germans did not intend, at that point at least, to seize the Middle East, and the British never intended at that point to go up through the Balkans. But we were intent on demonstrating that Greece had to be defended. So we sent the expeditionary force to Greece, and it was turfed out very swiftly once the Greeks, who had fought valiantly. My father, as it happens, was with the Greek army just before, and as the Germans were moving south and witness the genuine heroism of a relatively well-armed but hugely inferior force in terms of numbers, and they were important. Hitler had to send 3 divisions south in order to win in the Balkans. That meant the invasion, which had been intended for May, was delayed till June, which did mean that window of better weather was limited. I initially took the view that was a decisive in the outturn. I no longer, as I researched it, I felt that wasn't quite right, and I retreated from my own assumption, because the evidence wasn't persuasive. So more important was the problem that Hitler had in deciding what to do once he realized you couldn't just do it all at once. Did he go to the north? Did he secure Leningrad first and raise Leningrad to the ground? He said, did he go south to Kiev? This is in August of 41. Did he go south to Kiev and take the whole of the Lombard industrial region, as well as the massive, relatively massive, much exaggerated, incidentally, agricultural heartlands of Ukraine? You have to remember, Germany was was hungry, and that was one of the great problems. You had to feed your people, otherwise you were in trouble, as well as having to rape the land in order to feed your armies. But Hitler's dithering in August was far more significant than I think that delay. And if I'm right, because the weather wasn't decisive, the outcome would not have been very different. But this is why history is so fascinating, because you're dealing with all sorts of building blocks, Claudia, and you know. So you're constructing them. You're always constructing the past. There is no absolute certainty. You're trying to understand it better. Claudia's account of the Stalin's response to the invasion is a construction out of the available evidence. It's not guesswork. It's an interpretation on the basis of the evidence that is there, and people take different interpretations. Some still like to believe that without the D-Day, Hitler would have won. Now that is a palpable nonsense, but it is still widely believed. It accelerated the speed of the Soviet victory. What it mainly did, D-Day, was to protect Western Europe from the prospect of either a pact between Hitler's successors and Stalin, or a takeover of having a whole lot of satellite states controlled by Moscow in Western Europe. I don't know whether Claudia, I see she's nodding. You agree with that, Claudia? But people don't, on the whole, in the West, terribly want to hear that, even today, and for perfectly understandable reasons. People died on the Western Front. They fought, and they were, my father was one of those who was heavily involved. So it is not to diss what they did, to try and convey what really happened, and therefore where the war was won, and the implications of that for the creation of what happened at the end of the Second World War, the start of the Cold War, and the division of Europe into 2 blocks. Which is why, to summarize my final thought, 1941 was the most important year of the 20th century.
Thank you, Jonathan. Claudia, would you like to add anything further? No, it's a wonderful place to end. Thank you very much, both of you, Jonathan Dimbleby and Claudia Weber. So we started with 41, we ended with 44. We could have carried on, I think. But an hour and a half is probably enough. And many thanks too to the Geopolitics team and Professor Brendan Sims, who made the event possible. Thank you to those of you who asked questions. They are great questions. And if you didn't catch all of the event, or if you want to hear it again, it will be available via the Geopolitics Centre's website. Don't forget, there are many more webinars from the Centre for Geopolitics. For more details, go to the website, and where you can also get on the mailing list if you're interested. But for now, from the 3 of us, from here in Cambridge, it's goodbye for now, and join us again.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
That's great.